So you, me, and Ben watched a movie today
It was good.
at the theater.
Lots of popcorn was eaten.
So that's funny is that I get there, Ben's sitting in the middle because we have 3 seats for me, Scott, and Ben.
No, we had 2 seats for all 3 of us.
Anyway,
Just kidding.
Ben had a large thing of popcorn, a large Coke, and you have to have popcorn and a Coke for a movie.
Yes.
In the theater
Every
right?
time.
So he sits there, and we get there late, and Scott was like, "I'm gonna get myself a drink," and then you walk in with a drink and another large thing of popcorn.
Yeah.
So both of y'all, when y'all are done with how much y'all wanted to eat, passed me the leftover, soggy, not good stuff. So I sat there. We went through 2 large popcorns, and I was like, I want some fresh, So I turned to Ben, and I was like, if I get another large thing of popcorn, will you help me eat it, you and Scott? And he turns to me and goes, duh. So I got up, and I got a third large thing of popcorn and a Coke for myself. Needless to say, it was a good movie. But
yeah, Ben and I had the same strategy. He didn't eat breakfast or lunch. He said he literally just had a banana, and I think I had a couple cookies like right before I left the house, because I was like, I don't like going to a movie and eating a full meal, because then I can't sit and enjoy the popcorn. I feel like I just gotta pick at it. And I love popcorn. It's me and my wife's favorite snack, and so it's one of those things that.
And movie theater popcorn when it's hot, it's so good. So it was awesome. But
so good.
Today's episode, you sat down with Lisa Gilchrist.
Yep.
This is the second time we had her on. She was amazing the first time, and this time we got a little more specific with her. Talked about grief.
Yeah.
And you were sitting in that chair, so I was kind of doing the other stuff, but it was fascinating.
Yeah, it was cool to get to open up and talk about how I viewed grief, and getting to hear what grief actually was. That her knowledge of grief, it's actually a thing that helps us to grow. It's a good thing, and growing up, I never thought
it's a healing thing.
It's
right?
a healing thing. Yes, correct. I never thought of grief as that, and so it's cool to open my mind to that perspective and know that grief is not negative. That is a very good thing. It's very necessary. It's a way to get over the walls, to get over the things. And so it was just a really good conversation.
It was a really great conversation. It was. I didn't want it to end. Just like the last time she came. She's awesome. So y'all literally just like dove right in.
Yeah.
And so that's another reason why we're doing this. Maybe we'll do this from now on. I don't know. But kind of keep you updated on our lives and stuff. But this is Lisa Gilchrist, and we're talking about grief. Enjoy.
One thing that was with our family was the reason why it was easier for personally me. I don't know about a lot of my siblings, but for me, the reason why it was easier to grieve my dad passing was because I had a moment with God where God basically, I asked the Lord, like, Lord, why can't I pray for my dad and him be healed? And Jesus just responded to me and said, it's because I gave your dad free will to do with what he pleased. And what he did, there was consequences to what he did. So, for instance, my mom and dad, when we were little kids, they smoked. And so once we got saved, started attending church regularly, they quit. Well, then a lot of things happened with my family, and we lost. My dad had a very successful business, and he lost it. And we had to file bankruptcy, and we lost everything. We had to move to, all of us, 6 kids and 2 parents, to a 3-bedroom duplex. And it was really hard on my dad because he was working a job that he wasn't. My dad was always used to being a good businessman, making a lot of money. And so after that, he started smoking cigarettes, and he just continued on. And then when I was in college, he had a triple bypass surgery, and then after that, continued to smoke cigarettes. And then it wasn't until about 4 years after he had the triple bypass, he had a stroke, and that was finally when he stopped because he couldn't get up to go do it. And so he and then.
Completely limited.
Yes.
No choice anymore.
So it was a lot of that, and he had a breathing oxygen, and so he couldn't. You can't smoke with that, or else you might explode. It might explode, and so
scary.
Yeah, and so it was finally he went to just go to the VA to get a checkup, and they were like, "Hey, we noticed something off about your lungs. We're gonna do a biopsy." Come to find out, after the biopsy, they were like, "Yeah, I don't remember what it was called, but it was a disease that he got from smoking that never got better. It only got worse." And so they were like, you have from this time to maybe this time to live. And so it was kind of after that, from that point on, it was just a slow downhill battle where he was just declining. And I had my crying moments talking to God. I had my honest moment, honest prayers, talking to God. And it was one of those things that I came to that place where he was like, I gave your dad free will, and it's hard that we have to live with that, but it's your dad made choices. He brought many of us siblings to my dad to say, hey, you can beat this, you can stop, you don't have to do this. And I'm not hating on my dad at all. I love my dad. I wish my dad was still here.
That is the
miss him
definition of grief.
Yeah. Yeah. So I miss him tremendously, but it's one of those things for me, like, I guess saying grieving his loss when he passed away was easier for me because it wasn't just like, my dad was there and then he was just gone. It was like a slow decline of like health wise and knowing that, he was headed that way. That really, I guess, helped me.
Yeah, I can understand how, like, in just all of that, which is like trying to figure out where to speak to and and what, but it offers actually a lot of different categories that grief can fall into. Acknowledging the reality that this one wasn't quite sudden. It had elements maybe of sudden potential where that may grieve, but this is more like a cumulative or kind of collective grieving. I was thinking, on the way in, like, we pick up these losses along the way. And grief is different than sadness.
Yeah.
It's not just a sadness. It's a much deeper place of healing. I do appreciate that you were able and like bold to ask God directly.
Yeah.
Like, what is this? Like, and he told you directly and clearly to maybe give you that sustenance of, here's a unfair dose of reality.
Yeah.
By having family members who smoke, lung cancer, the whole 9 yards. But it's over time.
Yeah.
And so there are things like maybe anticipatory, like you're anticipating this thing coming. Grieving time that you didn't get with him to do really what you wanted to do. Having to go through all those things with a little bit of an absent, like the bankruptcy, like they're grief within grief within grief. But also exponential, maybe.
Yeah, and I remember through that period of time in my life, I would go and talk to people about it. I had mentors in my life. I'm the youngest of six siblings, so
you answered all my questions. I was like, how many are there, and where
So
are you?
yeah, I'm the youngest of six. There's my brother Craig. My sister is 10 years older than me, so she's 36. So Craig's 38.
Okay.
Jessica's 36. John is 33. Melissa's 30, and my brother Kyle is 16 months apart from me, so he's just basically a year older. So he's 27. But having my two oldest siblings, who were much older at the time, this happened 4.5 years ago when my dad passed away. So it's been quite an expanded time. But during that whole process, trying to seek wisdom from other people didn't work for me because it was often led at I don't know why this is happening. I don't know why, I don't know. But that was basically the main reason why I went to God about it, and in the moment realized that, I should have just been going to God about it the whole time. It's just sometimes with those emotions, I'm a very emotional person. A lot of people don't know that about me, but I'll sometimes bottle, which is bad. I know it's bad.
I don't put bad on things.
Oh, okay. So I know it's not
like
healthy.
Good or bad, maybe easy or hard or.
There's times I'm also the kind of person that's like, when I bottle, it allows me to internalize and think about it and forgive easier, to where when I speak, sometimes I speak too soon and I speak stuff that I shouldn't. Like I get aggressive and angry sometimes. And so with that, when I bottle, I realize, oh, I was being crazy. This wasn't that big of a deal. Let me get over myself. So it helps me to forgive.
It's a deep statement right there. Note to self, talking to a pastor. So many things, right? So easy to try to navigate that and be like, okay, wait. How do we normalize this? How do we not minimize this? It's easy. Like I think I was talking before, it's very easy to get lost in a grieving process. And grieving before the grief actually occurs. And I think you had said something earlier, like in that process, it helped me a little knowing this was kind of moving in that direction, so that when the grief comes and you have, older siblings who are there and available as well. And all of them, they're all older. So just trying to kind of hone in on that reality, and death is one level of grief and loss, but even in your story, like it has a huge hierarchy of different kinds of grief just within that one, right? And you thought it was just, my dad died.
Yeah,
like,
that's cool.
It's a lot bigger.
It's cool to see, like, you having a degree in this and been doing this for so long. It's cool to see, like, unpackaging things and getting to see things from a perspective of like, I didn't understand that at the time, but you saying that, I see it now. I'm like, oh, that makes a lot of sense. So in your mind, would you say there's like, this might be a crazy question, but is there an unhealthy way to grieve, and is there a healthier way to grieve?
That is a fair question. It's not so easy to answer on the spot. I'll start with maybe the grief that maybe gets, like, it's called inhibited grief or abbreviated grief, maybe a masked grief. This is a big word, but it's called disenfranchised grief. I think of a franchise. There's franchises all over the place, but it's been disenfranchised, so it's quite dysregulated, and parts of it are all over the place, and it's not consistent. And I think each of those pieces, though uniquely different, because we have a different word for each of them, if there was an overlap, there's a sense of like, it's really hard to acknowledge this right now in this moment, or someone else is unable to acknowledge what you're grieving because it may not be so typical, because it may not be so forthright that, and I do have those kinds of losses in my life where it would be easy for someone to want to dismiss that. Having parents that are still alive, but not having them, not just because I moved away, but because they were never there, or they just didn't know how to show up the way that I needed. And you might even, I have a sibling who has a hard time acknowledging that I grieve that because he's so driven by the relationship, with mom and dad, that are like, I'm going to grab this. I know what they are, but I'm going to grab this.
Yeah.
And he's leaning in where I'm actually more, no thanks.
Yeah.
But I can choose my grief. So healthy, unhealthy, it's never really done. I think there are waves that come, and there are different anniversaries that we experience where those things will come up. Again, it could also be disenfranchised in those moments. I have an example in my own life where at 19, my dad attempted suicide, and I went a week later to college. And every year, I grieve that happened, even though he's still alive. And I could go into it farther, but just recognizing, again, one, do people know that about me? Do I share those things so that they have an opportunity to let me grieve, or do I bottle and hold? And I wouldn't ever want to say that it's unhealthy. It's just learning how we've managed to cope with what we have, and maybe looking for those resources, whether it's going straight to God, building the community, talking to a pastor, friends. There's just, the gamut is super, super wide when we talk about grief. So we can go some specific places, so as not to stay so broad, but just recognizing like it's a very wide.
When you brought up anniversaries and reliving, the other day us here at Morningside, as a staff, we went on a retreat, and I actually rode with Pastor Bill, and we came to the church, and we were actually sitting in the front of the church, and I was like, man, we're gonna go out to these cabins and stuff like that, and I just thought about my dad, and I was like, and it just like hit me right there, and I hadn't felt like that since way before when he passed away. You know, I've had peace about all of it, and I just got really sad, and I was just like, man, you know, and I took some pictures of me and my dad, and I posted them on Facebook, and I was like, man, I wish I could just go camping with you one more time. And it all stemmed from a pastor that had posted a post and was talking about how the different generations respond to their parents at certain ages, and the one that was like 50 was like, oh yeah, I wish I knew what my dad knew or something like that. And I said, I often think about that now because I lost my dad. Like, I wish I could call him and be like, hey, what is credit? You know, like little things that, like, I know as simple as that is, or like, hey, you know, how do I replace the fuel filter on my truck? You know, like just these little things that I knew my dad was good at. And so it's just those little things that help me miss him a little more. Remember. Yeah.
And part of grief, you know, a lot of times in the background of my field, like I did a recent continuing education credit, and I picked prolonged grief, which is yet another one. Not that there's no time limit on it, but just recognizing the intensity of this over time, whether it's someone committing suicide or a divorce, a loss of really anything, but just in a very high kind of Richter scale kind of way, where, you know, this grief goes on, and grief is differentiated with like a yearning, a longing. So like just even hearing in your voice, like, oh, I just so wish, just one more time. Like, and the simplicity of someone saying something, going to a destination, being with people that are maybe father figures, and longing that. So grief is different than sadness, than depression, than, you know, even post-traumatic stress. However, grief is often embedded in each of those. I do kind of think like a square is a rectangle, but, you know, a rectangle is not a square. It just makes me think like you can experience grief without being traumatized. You cannot experience trauma without grief. There is a grief and healing process. Very small example. I have a really awesome like mug that a friend gave me, like she made it, and pottery and all this. It was just my favorite. And I was walking into work one day and I lost my grip and the whole bag fell and it shattered. And I was like, well, I'll be working in 5 minutes. So let's go up the stairs, find my office. And I didn't deal with it much until later. And I did find a way to repurpose it. But it makes me think of one of those examples of like, it wasn't really traumatic, but it was a grief of like, I lost my favorite mug. But where's the growth and resilience? And even when I think of grief as a baseline, whether it's losing, you know, a family member, a friend, a partner, a pet, you have to learn how to do life without them. You know, I think we often talk, and some of this is very common knowledge, but like, don't try to minimize it. Don't try to make it smaller. Don't try to paint over it. You know, don't really mess with it, really. So I guess I'm trying to think a little bit back to like the health of like, but I'm going to build some colorful rings around it. I'm going to learn to live and walk around this thing and dip into this thing and dip out of this thing. So even as the wave comes in, I'm going to lean into that wave. I think of our breathing, right? There's constant expansion and contraction in our breath. And in the same way, the emotion comes in, right? You're thinking of your sadness that comes in, the anger that comes in, and then it needs a release at some point. And so allowing even the breath, so that's kind of pulls a little bit more on some of the trauma somatic work of listening, acknowledging the grief, leaning into it, remembering, hey, this is great for self-protection. This is great for folding. This is great for getting smaller.
Mm-hmm.
But I also need to know that my shoulders can expand and that I can not stay stuck in either place.
Mm-hmm.
Titration of, fancy word, I get it, but basically moving in, holding, and purposely being able to move out and recognizing their safety to do so.
That's really interesting. That's actually very, in my mind, very thought-provoking to think, look back in life and be like, oh, what are those moments that I leaned in? What are those moments that I was like, I don't want to lean in and stuff. So it's
and
really
allowing
interesting.
Space for both, though, Scott.
Mm-hmm.
Like, there has to be space for both.
I think it's a healthy balance.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, that's cool. One thing I probably should have done at the beginning of this was to ask if we could describe grief and describe kind of what it looks like and what it is. So I know people probably know what grief looks like, what it is, but just to hear like a smart way to say it, I guess. I don't know.
You're hysterical.
Thanks. I'm a youth pastor. We ask crazy things, and sometimes it's just us.
It is.
You know, we're a
for
people
the
group.
moment. Yeah. Let's keep it that way. I don't need more grief. I have this up on my phone just because it helps me, but everything went away for a second. I was like, I just deleted everything that I wrote. My heart rate started increasing, and I was like, where is this?
Yeah, that's a really nerve-wracking thing when you're speaking to a bunch of students and you go to scroll your notes and then it's blank and you're like,
God.
I know what the Lord said, but there was a lot of other things in here I needed. And so you start freaking out, and then you realize you just scrolled too far. And I was like, oh, scroll back. I found it.
Yeah, I had to do the back arrow, though. It better be there. Better be there. So that's not quite grief. That's a little bit of like a trauma response. Okay, so you're asking what is grief?
Yes.
Grief technically is a healing process.
Okay, see, that's...
Yeah.
I would have never known that. I never heard of it in that way, so to hear that is knowledge to me.
Yeah, I love that. But, and again, things I've searched for, things that I've dove into. Is that the right word?
I think it is. Now it is.
Dived? Divin?
Divin?
Dove in.
Dove into?
Dove into.
I'm diving in. I don't know.
Diving in.
Yeah.
Diving in.
Yeah.
That's a Stephen Curtis Chapman song.
It is. That's an oldie.
It is
but
so
a goodie.
I'm grieving. I actually met Stephen Curtis Chapman. Talk about grief. They have a really cool story. Actually, he and his wife both wrote a book, each of them. Did you know that her name was already Chapman? Her last name was Chapman.
I did not know that. So
cool.
But that was easy. She didn't have to change the last name.
No, she got to keep it. No grief there.
Yeah.
Sometimes women grieve having to lose their last name.
Yeah, some people.
Okay, what is grief? No, grief is to grieve is to heal. Healing through the grief. It's not just one thing. I have a picture of this. You can look it up, but it's called a tangled ball of emotions, and it can have anxiety. There can be abandonment. There can be rage. There can be confusion. There's ambiguity to grief, all the different kinds that come through grief on top of grief. I love that we have grace on top of grace.
Mm-hmm.
Sometimes we have grief on top of grief, and grief within a grief, like I was talking about before. There might be resentment, right? There might be overwhelm, depression, all of those things, but to acknowledge them, I think is really, if I'm going to go back to the foundation of supporting the nervous system, which I know I talked a little bit about in my last one that you guys had me on, is to honor the body and what it has had
That's a
to
good way
do.
to
You
look
know,
at it.
I think some people are like, oh, they're so wrecked with grief. Like, I just think of like this, the whole body gets involved when you're sobbing, when you're grieving, and it can kind of take over. But there's a healing in that even.
Yeah.
So I know it can be really maybe graphic and intense and confusing, and tears show up out of nowhere, and I'm mad and I'm confused and I don't know where to go, and this has ended before I was ready. And I don't know if there's like one picture, but I guess I think of like maybe Sagrada Familia, or like a stained glass window that has been shattered, but it has also been reconstructed, you know, with like the moldings in between, or like
I just saw
Very
when you said that, I saw a mental picture of a stained glass window breaking and then someone taking and making a new picture out of the stained glass window.
Oh, I love that.
And so making a new thing out of the broken. And so that was what
a
you
lot
said.
of times it's a lot stronger than
What
what
you
it
said
was
about
before.
the healing thing, that's something I never thought about, because in my point of view, when I've ever thought about grief, it's always been on the negative side of things. And so the negative
Help me
context.
understand that.
So, to help you understand, like, whenever I, growing up or even now as an adult, ever hear like someone's grieving, I'm like, oh, you know, to me, it's not a healing process. It's a process of pain. Like, they're in a area of like grieving a loss, grieving something, you know, in my mind, it's always a negative. And so to know that now, to hear that, it changes the perspective in me to see that, oh, this is just a necessary process to get to healing and to get on the other side of the hurt and stuff. And so it's cool to put two and two together. See, knowledge.
Well, yes.
Yeah.
And growth.
Yep.
And resilience. And now you can share with other people, and
Yeah.
you can notice it in other people. And, you know, I was talking to someone this morning, and before I even said a word, she was like, is there heaviness that you're experiencing? And I was like, how'd you know I was going to talk to you about that? I was really sad this morning. I know I'm talking about grief, but like, this is just, and I know that in my job there, I gather sadnesses. I have learned, I did receive a prophetic word at one point and said, you need to basically stop gathering sadness and release joy. And that turned my shift around of like, oh, just give me all your sadness. I'll take it all. And it's like the Christmas Santa, Christmas bag of presents that's like, well, this does feel kind of negative and heavy. And so having that word before I even became a counselor was like, you're going to learn how to release joy. You're going to learn how to take these things and not leave them the way they were. And God has been gracious, you know, to help me do that as I sit with people. But I do recognize it's a natural byproduct of sitting longer periods of time with people and getting to know their story.
Yeah.
But even in that, maybe there's a grief of, like, I didn't even know that about you, or having someone else to join in on what that is, and a shared experience with someone, grieving that you don't have those shared experiences anymore. I mean, it's almost like a baseball hitting glass and like the shattered glass, but it didn't fully break either.
Yeah.
And it's like grief can come through any spoke.
Yeah.
It can come through any of those lines, but they're jaggedy and they're not straight, and they're tight together, and some are far apart. And
That's
yeah,
that's good.
I hit it our home window with a baseball bat, and that actually happened.
Wow. Cool.
But it didn't shatter on me, so
Yeah.
that was the image
I
that
remember,
I was thinking of.
I
when
think
shared that.
often, like you said, how it's the glass window with the different cracks and everything. I often thought of grief as, I remember when I was at summer camp when I was a kid, one of our friends, they were just throwing rocks as far as they could.
Yeah.
And one of them he threw hit the back of one of our leaders' car windows. And I often think of grief as this, where it's at the beginning of it, it was just a small little hole where the rock went through. Yeah. And then because of the different temperatures of the inside of the car and the outside of the car, it just cracked all the way through. And then I remember the hole went from this little hole where the rock was to a size of like a small melon. And then it was just like bigger and bigger. And so I've always looked at grief as something that's like it starts out kind of small and then it just grows and it gets to a point where it's like it's just over. And that's the way I've always thought about it. And so to hear this, that's why I always like talking to people about their perspectives.
Yeah.
Because different people's perspectives can blow your mind. Why someone did what they did. It sometimes just gets me.
Yes.
And so
in different ways too.
Yes. Sometimes I'm like
in the funny ways and in like the not so funny ways.
But I'm always the kind of person I love laughing. But yeah.
Laughter would be a coping. We would cope with grief through laughter or something.
Yes. So I know it's my way of coping, I guess, is sometimes I like to crack jokes about stuff because I'd rather not everybody in the room feel bad for me. I would rather everybody in the room laugh with me and we'd be all having a good time because I know, and this is the thing I was thinking about this entire time when we were coming in this conversation, was I can grieve better because I know I get to see my dad again. I have told our students this multiple times. I don't know how it would be so hard for me to grieve my father and to understand the death of things and the gist of all of it if I didn't know I wasn't going to get to see my dad again. Getting to go to heaven and getting to have that time again with him where I get to see him and he's in his glorified body walking the streets of gold up there with God.
And so will we be.
And yes, and we will too. And so that's the thing that helps me too is like, for someone that might not be saved, that might not be the same case.
Right.
But for me, I have that confidence knowing that I do get to see my dad again someday. And, when I get to heaven, of course, I want to see Jesus. Of course, I want to see God. I want to be there. I want to and be in that moment. But I also want to see my dad again. Mm-hmm. And so that's what gives me peace. And so thinking about this whole situation, the whole conversation we're having, that was one thing that I always remembered would give me peace. And it hurts to think that some people don't have that reassurance.
Right. I guess maybe one thing of many, but when I talk about acknowledging something, there can also be an acknowledgement of like, I'm avoiding this hard thing right now. Mm-hmm. Again, part of that may be restrictive. I don't want people to see it. Some of the different types, like just masking it, maybe being distracted by something. Like, let's not go there right now. I've watched a lot of people move towards something and then it's just like a hard right or a hard left or like, we're pivoting. Mm-hmm. That was a red Corvette that just went by, and this thing is just trailing along. And it's like, we need those to integrate. We need the Corvette to come back around. Or the Charger or whatever car you want. Yeah. Whatever color you want. Mm-hmm. But again, just seeing that and saying, okay, I have a choice to offer that person. This might be worth a pause. This might be worth a delay. This might cause frustration because I've disrupted something. Like there was a part of your story that was like, oh my gosh, Scott, there's so much I want to say to you. But there's also a choice of like, let him finish the thought, let him finish part of the story. But you begin to look at that story and you say, okay, I'm also digging a little bit deeper on my end, not just for you, but in this awareness of we have some underlying content here. And we might be looking in a therapeutic, traumatic model with grief. Where have I felt this way before? Is it happening again? Mm-hmm. Where does it show up over here? How do I help support someone and say, actually, that's actually from back here. Mm-hmm. I think I wrote down something in some of my notes. And again, without it being too personal, I don't mind getting personal. I just don't want to get lost in it. But just that idea of like when I was and I might have touched on it last time, but when I was 16, I got in a really bad car accident. But I didn't get hospitalized. I had all the things. I went home. But I didn't actually deal with that particular car accident until I was like 31. When I started some of this journey of building where I am now. But I realized through dealing with the car accident and grieving, like I was grieving my life unlived. And I hadn't ever thought about it that way, but like I repeated to myself with the help of a counselor, like, can you please repeat, I'm alive. I'm alive. I'm alive. And the body responds to what it says. Like back, like it hears it back, and it's like if I'm overwhelmed, I'm gonna behave overwhelmed. If I say this is stressful and I can manage it, this is really stressful, and there's containment, or I can manage it. And I'm not saying there aren't things that are overwhelming and go beyond us. I'm just saying it matters how we talk to ourselves and how we talk to others.
The power of life and death in the tongue.
Very much so. And just that awareness of coming back to myself and saying, like, I'm waking up to something in my early 30s, and I can actually go back way before my car accident, grieving a life that I wasn't there for, doing it on autopilot, which is part of grief, like going back to detachment at times, like I just can't go there, so I'll just pull away. And I would not want for people to delay it too long. I wouldn't want people to have to, like, makes me think of it like I was in college, and I was walking by myself from class, and out of nowhere there was a hole, and my whole left leg just found the hole, and it went all the way up to my hip.
Oh, that's impressive.
But I just kept walking. Like, my leg came out, and I just kept walking. And even still to this day, I'm like, did that even really happen?
Yeah.
But I remember the dirt. Like, it was so fast, though. And I think of it a little bit like that. Like, again, I'm not going to say it's unhealthy. It's just more like, I need to, like, whoa, that was really fast. Or maybe someone else is grieving, and it's like, there's no time limit on this, but I wonder if you bypassed something. I wonder if, like, that was a lot. Don't dismiss it. And when others don't dismiss it, my hope is that it's easier for you to kind of recognize, like, if someone else isn't dismissing it for me, why am I dismissing it? Why am I trying to muscle my way through? Maybe as a guy, it's like you just feel like you have to. And maybe girls are like, oh, no one can see that. Like, I'm going to hide that part of me. So for different reasons, we may still do that.
Yeah.
I think it would be interesting to hear a little bit more of, like, how guys and girls do that differently. But I just think of that moment and think, like, oh, that deserves some acknowledgement in that grief.
Yeah. So taking time to reflect and kind of process is good, healthy. So there's no bad way to grieve. It's a good, because like I said before, I always thought of it as a bad thing. So grief being a healthy thing, there shouldn't be a bad way to grieve. There's always, it's just grieving. It's healthy. It's refocusing.
And it is unique to the individual. And you can, again, I know all the time, but there's individual grief, there's family grief, school-wide, nationwide grief, like 9/11 or tsunamis, Vietnam, like just, and I was even thinking, again, we could talk about this for such a long time, losing an arm, military, sports, not being able to finish the career you wanted, loss of identity, so many things. And I know even, you working with the youth, it's like you can lose your youth, and you grew up too fast, and too many to name. So it is something that I know people nowadays can easily look up and say, what are these types? But developing it in a off the paper experience, I'd find that part fascinating in my job, to say, here's what it looks like on paper. Here's what it looks like in real life.
That's interesting. That's very thought-provoking. Makes me think deep about my life.
I've been told I go a little bit deep.
No, that's I think oftentimes people don't go deep enough. I think, especially in the church world, it's very like just kind of
The maintained
overlooked,
surface.
covered up, not wanting to be talked about. And that's one thing that here at staff, that on the staff here at the church, that we've talked about, like, we don't brush over those things. We don't minimize those things. Like, if someone needs help, and that's why I've always been a very big supporter of counseling.
Yeah.
Because I know that you went and got a degree for what you did,
I did.
and it has qualified you to do what you do. And I think, and for me especially, if I'm frustrated, overwhelmed, grieving, whatever, if I just talk about it, it makes me feel so much better. It helps me when I'm speaking to process within myself. And so knowing that in myself, I personally believe that it's one of the things that is very necessary to church. Because yes, as pastors, we are here to counsel and to help. But there are things that you know about the human body, about how a brain and different things function, that I don't. And as much as the Holy Spirit can help me, God created your career for a purpose, on purpose, to help the body. Because we're all different body parts working together to get the common goal across. And so that's cool.
And thankfully, he's the creator of all of them, so that in each of those unique places, he holds, the key, the key of that perfection of, like, because he is the almighty counselor, I can also do what I do because I look to him in those moments.
Yeah, I think that's why us here at the church are so passionate about Christian counseling, is because it's not only just looking from a book knowledge, it's a heavenly supernatural knowledge of being able to listen to the Holy Spirit and counsel from that perspective. I think that's something that's very necessary in the world today. That's not sometimes
it's like I know where, I'm not sure where we're at, but like I think of, there could be a lot of controversy, maybe not. Like when he says, "Don't grieve the Holy Spirit," like that's a whole other conversation. Like the worst, don't do this thing. Don't grieve the Holy Spirit.
Yeah.
But it's not one emotion, I guess, either. Like I said, it's just this tangled ball, and we get the opportunity to sort through it while we're on this side of heaven.
Yeah. And it's a healthy experience.
It is a healthy experience.
Yeah. I hope that my biggest hope in this conversation is that there might be people out there that are like me that didn't know that it's a very healthy thing. And I'm really glad that we had this conversation, and I'm really glad that we've both been able to share different experiences and stuff. And you've been able to, one of my favorite things to do is to listen to people that have knowledge on things that I have no knowledge about. And so I like to learn. I'm a learner. And so I like to learn. And so it's really cool to hear a perspective of someone that has a degree in this and does this for a living. So.
And I guess I want to speak just a very brief moment to, the reality of that sharing, because without going into a lot of it, like in relationship with people, it's not lost on me that we want to be felt, seen, heard, and understood. And those are really the bulk of our senses. And so to know something about someone is to, like, I would grieve if I didn't know that about you, and that we were, talking. So there's an element of, like, I can be mindful of that. And in that mindfulness, without having to plaster the whole story or do the whole trauma of reliving, that series of events that you went through in a pretty short amount of time, is also something, as a trauma therapist and kind of grief awareness, to make sure we don't go so fast through those pieces at a pace that works for you.
Yeah.
Just not too fast.
Yeah.
Because then I can't process what you're saying.
Yeah, that's
Because I'm a slow processor.
Mhm.
I'm deep, but I'm a very slow processor.
Yeah, I'm a processor so as well. Whenever me and my wife talk about things, even not even arguing, just talk about things.
Just try.
Like she'll be talking like, "Oh, we should do this, we should do that." I'm always like, "Yeah, well, I could do this to make this happen." Like I'm always processing like, "Oh, how could we make that happen?" In my head. And sometimes she just has to be like, "Babe, you don't have to process this. This is just an idea." And I'm like, "Okay."
I like it.
Yeah. So
But she knows that about you.
Yes, and she loves it about me, I guess,
Yeah.
because I always usually come back with, "Hey, well, I always try to shoot holes in things because then we can work how to figure out how to patch the holes,
Okay.
and then I also like to just have good ideas to help the situation
Yeah.
because I also sometimes pressure myself to have good ideas, and then nothing happens, and so when I just
Yay
get to
for
think,
grief.
yeah, when I get to sit there and think, I get to process and have good ideas, I guess.
It is a good thing.
Mm-hmm.
It's just interesting to hear you say it was more of a negative. Like, it's just always been like, oh, when isn't there grief, I guess?
Yeah. And never even thought about that either. Like the grieving of, because my entire life hearing grief was something that had to do with death, someone dying. And so grieving, a mug, grieving something like never heard of that concept. And so to think about that and apply that to different situations where I was like, okay, so that was me grieving. That
Absolutely.
was so.
And then you can make that connection, and then it's like, oh, it has somewhere to land.
Interesting.
We could go on
learned
for a
something
long
today. I
time,
know
but
we
yeah,
could.
we just-
But thank you again for
Yeah.
coming on.
Thank you for having me for a second time.
We will probably have you again because these
Yeah.
conversations are just great. We love getting to hear your side of things from your perspective and, with the knowledge you have. And I don't want to belittle that knowledge at all. Like it is, I'm so thankful.
It's a blessing to even just participate and be a part of something.
Yeah. And so thank you for being here.
Yeah.
Thank you for joining and watching. We love you guys. Thank you for supporting. And thank you again for being here.
You're welcome. You're welcome.
Thanks for listening, and be sure to follow Restoration Podcast on Spotify and Apple. If you're watching on YouTube, please like, comment, and subscribe.